The night my father kicked me out of the house, my sister was standing behind him with a look I didn't understand until 12 years later. I was 18 years old, and it was supposed to be one of the happiest nights of my life. There was still half a birthday cake sitting on the kitchen counter, the candles barely melted into the frosting, and the smell of vanilla drifting through the house I had grown up in. Our place was a quiet two-story home in a small suburb outside Columbus, Ohio, the kind of neighborhood where everyone mowed their lawns on Saturday mornings and waved when you walked past with the dog. For 18 years, I believed that house was the safest place in the world. I believed my father, Richard Carter, trusted me. I believed my older sister, Olivia, would always have my back. I was wrong about both of them. It started less than an hour after dinner. My father called my name from the living room in a voice I had never heard before, low and tight, like something inside him had snapped. When I walked in, he was standing near the coffee table with his arms crossed. Olivia was leaning against the wall behind him, quiet, watching everything. There was a small metal lockbox sitting on the table. I recognized it immediately. My father kept important things inside it, documents, a little emergency cash, things he didn't want lying around the house. He looked at me and said a sentence that would split my life into two different stories. "Emily, where is the money?" At first I honestly thought he was joking. I laughed a little and asked what he meant. But he didn't smile. Not even a little. He opened the lockbox and turned it toward me. Inside was nothing but empty space. He said there had been $5,000 in there that morning. $5,000 that he had been saving for months. And according to my sister, I was the one who took it. The words hit me so suddenly that for a moment I couldn't even process them. I turned toward Olivia, expecting her to laugh and say it was a misunderstanding. But she didn't laugh. She didn't correct him. She just folded her arms and looked at the floor like someone who had already decided how the story was going to end. I told my dad he had to be mistaken. I told him I had never even opened the lockbox. But every sentence I said seemed to make his expression harder. His face turned the color it always did when he was deeply disappointed, the same look he used to give me when I forgot chores or came home past curfew. Except this time it wasn't disappointment. It was something colder. Olivia finally spoke, her voice soft and careful. She said she had seen me near the study earlier that afternoon. She said she didn't want to believe it at first, but the money had disappeared right after I walked out of the room. The moment she finished talking, I felt something shift in the air between us. My father didn't ask another question. He didn't check anything else. He didn't even look uncertain. Instead, he walked to the front hallway, grabbed the old suitcase from the closet, and set it down in front of me. Then he said 4 words that still echo in my head even now, 12 years later. "Pack your things and leave." For a few seconds I thought he was bluffing. My father had always been strict, but he had never said anything like that before. I stared at the suitcase on the hallway floor and waited for him to sigh, shake his head, and say we would figure it out together. Instead, he looked straight at me with a calm expression that felt far more frightening than if he had been shouting. "I am not going to ask again," he said slowly. "Pack your things and leave my house." The words echoed through the hallway, bouncing off the walls that were covered with family photos from years of birthdays, vacations, and school graduations. In every one of those pictures we looked like a normal, happy family. In that moment it felt like those memories belonged to strangers. I turned to Olivia again because I still believed there had to be some kind of mistake. "Tell him," I said. "You know I would never do something like that." She did not meet my eyes. She kept looking down at the floor, twisting a strand of her blonde hair around her finger the way she always did when she wanted to look nervous. "I wish that were true," she said quietly. "But I saw you near the study this afternoon." Her voice sounded gentle, almost sympathetic, which somehow made the accusation feel even worse. I tried to explain again. I told my father that I had been in the study earlier because I was looking for a pen to finish a college application form. I reminded him that the community college acceptance letter had arrived that morning and that we had talked about it during dinner. But none of it mattered. My father had already made up his mind. He shook his head and said that trust was the most important thing in a family, and once it was broken there was nothing left to talk about. Hearing that felt like someone had quietly erased 18 years of my life. I packed slowly because a part of me still believed that if I took long enough he would change his mind. I folded 2 pairs of jeans, a couple of shirts, and the gray sweater my mother had given me years before she passed away. The suitcase was old and the zipper stuck halfway, so I had to pull it carefully to close it. Every small sound in that hallway seemed too loud. My father stood near the front door watching without saying another word. Olivia stayed in the living room, just out of sight, but I could feel her presence like a shadow in the corner of my vision. When I finished packing I stood there with the suitcase handle in my hand, unsure what to say. I wanted my father to look at me and see the daughter he had raised, the girl who used to help him wash the car in the driveway every Sunday afternoon. Instead he opened the front door and stepped aside. Outside the air was cool and the streetlights had already come on, casting pale circles of light across the quiet neighborhood. I remember checking the time on the microwave in the kitchen as I walked past it. It was 11:40 at night. 11:40 on my 18th birthday. I stepped onto the front porch with $43 in my wallet, an old suitcase in my hand, and absolutely no idea where I was supposed to go. The door closed behind me with a soft click that somehow sounded louder than a slam. I stood there for a long moment staring at the wood grain of that door, half expecting it to open again. It never did. Across the street the Johnson family still had their living room lights on and their television flickered against the curtains. Everything in the neighborhood looked exactly the same as it had every other night of my childhood. The only difference was that I no longer belonged inside the house behind me. That was the moment I understood something that would shape the next 12 years of my life. My father had chosen to believe my sister, and nothing I said was going to change that. I stood on that porch longer than I want to admit, staring at the door like it might suddenly open again if I waited long enough. The porch light above my head buzzed softly and the cool Ohio night air crept through the thin sweater I was wearing. Across the street a car drove past slowly and the headlights slid over the quiet houses, over the trimmed lawns and white fences that had always made this neighborhood feel safe. I had walked those sidewalks since I was a little girl riding a pink bicycle with training wheels. But that night the street felt unfamiliar, like I was standing in a place that no longer belonged to me. Eventually the reality settled in. My father was not going to open the door. Olivia was not going to run outside and say she had made a mistake. I picked up the suitcase and walked down the driveway toward the sidewalk, each step feeling heavier than the last. I checked my phone and scrolled through my contacts, trying to think of someone who might let me stay for the night. At 18 years old I had plenty of classmates, but very few people you could call close friends. Most of them still lived with their own families and I knew showing up at midnight with a suitcase would raise a lot of questions. After a moment I stopped on the corner and dialed the only person who came to mind, my friend Megan from high school. She answered after a few rings, her voice sleepy and confused. When I told her what had happened there was a long pause on the other end of the line, the kind of silence that usually meant someone was trying to understand something that did not make sense. Finally she said that her parents would not mind if I stayed for a few days. Hearing that simple sentence felt like someone had just handed me a life preserver in the middle of deep water. Megan lived about 2 miles away, which normally would have been a short drive, but that night I did not have a car and I did not want to call a taxi with the little money I had left. So I started walking. The suitcase wheels rattled along the sidewalk, bumping over cracks in the concrete. The neighborhood slowly changed as I moved farther from the street where I grew up. The houses became smaller, the streetlights farther apart, and the quiet suburban calm gave way to the distant hum of late-night traffic from the highway. Every few minutes I looked back over my shoulder even though there was nothing behind me except empty pavement and dark windows. Part of me kept expecting to hear my father calling my name from the end of the street. Part of me believed he would realize he had made a mistake and drive after me. But the road stayed silent. About 20 minutes into the walk my arms were already tired from pulling the suitcase and my mind kept replaying the scene in the living room again and again. Olivia standing quietly behind our father. The empty lockbox on the coffee table. The way he did not hesitate before telling me to leave. I kept asking myself the same question over and over. Why would she do that? Olivia and I had argued plenty of times growing up, the way sisters often do, but framing me for stealing money from our own father was something completely different. The thought twisted in my stomach as I kept walking through the cold night air. By the time I reached Megan's street my legs ached and the suitcase wheels sounded like they were ready to fall off. Her house was a small blue place at the end of a cul-de-sac with a porch light glowing warmly over the front steps. When she opened the door and saw the suitcase in my hand her eyes widened with shock, but she stepped aside immediately and said I could come in. As I crossed the doorway into that unfamiliar living room I realized something quietly important. The life I had known for 18 years had ended the moment that front door closed behind me, and whatever came next was going to be something I would have to build entirely on my own. The first few weeks after I arrived at Megan's house felt like living inside someone else's life. Her parents were kind people, the kind who spoke gently and asked careful questions without pushing too hard for answers. They cleared a small space for me in their finished basement where there was an old couch that folded into a bed and a lamp with a warm yellow light that made the room feel less lonely at night. I kept my suitcase near the wall and tried to stay out of the way as much as possible because I knew I was only supposed to be there temporarily. Every morning I woke up early and listened to the quiet sounds of their house starting another normal day upstairs, coffee brewing in the kitchen, Megan's father reading the newspaper, Megan's mother moving dishes around the sink. Those ordinary sounds reminded me of the home I had lost, and sometimes that memory sat heavily on my chest before I even climbed the stairs. During the first few days I kept checking my phone, expecting to see my father's name appear on the screen. I thought maybe he would calm down and realize the situation had gone too far. I thought maybe he would call and ask me to come home so we could talk about what really happened with the money. But the phone never rang. Days turned into a full week, and then 2 weeks, and there was still nothing. No call, no message, not even a short text asking if I was safe. That silence slowly forced me to understand something difficult. My father truly believed I had stolen from him, and as long as he believed that, I no longer had a place in his life. Once that truth settled in, I stopped waiting for the phone to ring and started focusing on what came next. I had been accepted into a local community college, but tuition still cost more money than I had. $43 was not going to last very long, and I could not stay in Megan's basement forever. So I began looking for work anywhere that would hire someone with almost no experience. Within a few days, I found a part-time job at a small diner about 3 miles from Megan's house. The place was open 24 hours and smelled constantly like coffee and grilled onions, but the manager was willing to give me evening shifts as a waitress. My first night there I wore a borrowed pair of black shoes that were half a size too big and carried a small notepad in my apron pocket while trying to memorize the menu. The job was not glamorous, but every tip I collected felt like a tiny step toward independence. I worked late into the night and then walked back to Megan's house under the orange glow of the streetlights, counting the crumpled bills in my pocket and wondering how long it would take before I could afford a place of my own. Meanwhile the days slowly turned into months. I saved as much money as possible and enrolled in a few community college classes during the mornings, studying business and basic accounting because I had always liked working with numbers. My schedule became simple and exhausting at the same time. School during the day, work at the diner in the evening, and quiet hours in the basement at night where I read textbooks and tried not to think about the family that had disappeared from my life. Every once in a while the memory of that night would return unexpectedly, the empty lockbox on the table, my sister's calm voice repeating the accusation, my father standing by the door telling me to leave. Those memories still hurt, but they also pushed me forward. Because if there was one thing I had learned since walking away from that house with a single suitcase, it was that the only way to survive was to keep moving forward even when the road ahead looked uncertain. Life slowly settled into a rhythm that was both exhausting and strangely steady. By the time a full year had passed since the night I left my father's house, my days were built around survival and small progress. I continued taking classes at the community college in the mornings, focusing on accounting and business courses because numbers made sense in a way people sometimes did not. Numbers followed rules. If you worked through a problem carefully enough, the answer would always reveal itself. People, on the other hand, could change your entire life with a single accusation. In the evenings I worked at the diner, moving quickly between tables with a pot of coffee in one hand and a notepad in the other. I learned which regular customers liked extra cream in their coffee, which truck drivers preferred the corner booths, and which families came in after late baseball games with hungry teenagers who ordered everything on the menu. The tips were never large, but every dollar mattered. After nearly 10 months of saving carefully, I finally reached a point where I could afford something small but important. I found a tiny studio apartment above a laundromat about 15 minutes away from campus. The place was barely 400 square feet, with a narrow kitchen, a single window facing the parking lot, and a radiator that clanked loudly whenever the heat turned on. But when I carried my suitcase up the narrow staircase and unlocked that door for the first time, it felt like stepping into a new chapter of my life. The furniture came from second-hand stores and a few donations from Megan's family. A small table near the window became my study space, and the old couch folded out into a bed every night. It was not glamorous, but it was mine. Living alone forced me to grow up quickly. I learned how to stretch a grocery budget for an entire week, how to fix a dripping faucet using instructions from the internet, and how to manage my time between work and school without falling behind. There were still difficult moments, especially on quiet evenings when the apartment felt too silent and my thoughts wandered back to the family I had lost. Sometimes I would catch myself wondering what my father and Olivia were doing at that exact moment. Were they sitting at the same kitchen table where the birthday cake had once been? Did they ever talk about me, or had I simply disappeared from their lives like an old photograph placed in a drawer? Those questions never had answers, so eventually I stopped asking them. Instead, I focused on building something new. 2 years after enrolling in community college, I graduated with strong grades and transferred into a state university business program with the help of a small scholarship and the money I had saved from the diner. By then I had moved into a slightly larger apartment, closer to campus, and found a better paying job as a part-time assistant in a local accounting office. It was the first time I worked somewhere with quiet desks, computer screens, and organized files instead of coffee cups and dinner plates. I remember sitting at that desk during my first week and realizing how far I had come since the night I walked 2 miles through the dark with a single suitcase. The road had not been easy, but step by step I had built something stable out of the pieces of a life that once felt completely broken. And even though a part of my past still lingered in the back of my mind, the truth was that the future I was creating no longer depended on the people who had turned their backs on me. 12 years can pass quietly when you are busy building a life from the ground up. By the time I finished my university degree and started working full-time at the accounting office, the sharp edges of my past had slowly worn down into something more distant. I eventually moved out of Ohio and accepted a position with a financial consulting firm in Denver, Colorado. The city was larger, the mountains stood tall in the distance, and for the first time since I was 18 years old I felt like I was living somewhere that belonged entirely to me. My apartment overlooked a busy street filled with coffee shops and small bookstores, and every morning I walked to work with a cup of coffee in my hand while the sun rose over the buildings. My days became filled with spreadsheets, client meetings, and quiet evenings where I cooked simple dinners and read books on the couch. Most people who met me there had no idea about the girl who once walked 2 miles through a dark neighborhood with a suitcase and $43 in her wallet. I did not talk about it often because I had learned that the past only holds power if you keep reopening the door. For many years that door stayed firmly closed. I built friendships, developed a stable career, and slowly reached a point where life felt calm instead of uncertain. But the past has a strange way of returning when you least expect it. One afternoon, nearly 12 years after the night my father told me to leave, I came home from work and found a single envelope sitting in my mailbox. It looked ordinary at first, the kind of standard white envelope that could hold a bill or a piece of advertising mail. But when I looked closer I noticed the return address printed in the top left corner. It was an address from the same small town in Ohio where I had grown up. My stomach tightened immediately even before I read the name written beside that address. Richard Carter. My father. I stood there in the hallway of my apartment building holding the envelope for a long time without opening it. For more than a decade I had imagined what it would feel like to hear from him again. Sometimes I pictured an apology. Sometimes I imagined anger or accusations. But when the moment finally arrived, the reality felt quieter and more complicated than anything I had imagined. The envelope was thin and light in my hands. Inside there was only a single sheet of paper folded neatly in half. I carried it upstairs to my apartment and placed it on the kitchen table before finally sitting down. For several minutes I simply stared at my father's handwriting on the front, recognizing the careful block letters he had always used when writing addresses on birthday cards. It felt strange to see something so familiar after so many years of silence. Eventually I took a deep breath and opened the envelope. The letter inside was short, only a few paragraphs written in dark blue ink. The first line stopped me completely. It said that there was something important I needed to know, and that he believed he might have made the worst mistake of his life. As I read further, I discovered that Olivia had disappeared from his life nearly 6 months earlier. According to the letter, she had taken a large amount of money from his savings before leaving town without explanation. He had not heard from her since. The final lines of the letter were the ones that lingered in my mind long after I finished reading. He wrote that the situation had forced him to think about the past in ways he had never considered before, and that he now wondered if he had judged the wrong daughter all those years ago. For a long time after I finished reading the letter, I simply sat at the kitchen table staring at the paper in front of me. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant sounds of traffic moving along the street outside. 12 years of silence had been broken by a single page of handwriting, and suddenly the past I had worked so hard to bury was sitting directly in front of me again. I read the letter a second time, slower this time, paying attention to every sentence. My father had not written the word apology anywhere on the page, but the tone of his message carried something close to regret. He explained that Olivia had told him she needed money for a business opportunity and had convinced him to give her access to part of his savings. A few days later she disappeared, taking much more than he had agreed to and leaving behind nothing but a short message saying she needed time away. At first he believed she would come back, but months had passed without any sign of her. That was when he began thinking about the past. That was when he began thinking about the night he had asked me to leave. When I reached the last sentence again, I felt a strange mix of emotions I had not expected. Part of me felt anger rising from memories that had never fully disappeared. Another part of me felt something quieter and heavier, like the slow realization that time had changed all of us in ways we could never reverse. I folded the letter carefully and leaned back in my chair while the evening light faded through the window beside the table. The city outside continued moving the same way it always did, cars passing, people walking home from work, life continuing without interruption. But inside my apartment everything felt paused, like the world had stepped briefly into the past. For years I had imagined what I would say if my father ever contacted me again. I had rehearsed long speeches in my mind about the truth of what happened that night, about how quickly he had believed my sister and how easily he had erased me from his life. Yet now that the moment had arrived, those imagined speeches felt less important than I once believed. Instead, I found myself thinking about the 18-year-old girl standing on the porch with a suitcase and wondering what she would want me to say now. Eventually I stood up and walked to the small desk near the living room window where I usually handled work emails and personal paperwork. I opened my laptop and stared at the blank screen for several minutes before I began typing. The words came slowly at first, careful and measured. I told him that I had received his letter and that I understood why he was questioning the past now. Then I wrote something I had not planned to say but suddenly felt necessary. I told him that the night he asked me to leave had changed the entire direction of my life, but that I had still managed to build something meaningful from the pieces. I explained that I finished college, moved to Colorado, and created a career that allowed me to support myself without depending on anyone else. Finally, I wrote about the truth he had never taken the time to hear 12 years earlier. I told him clearly that I had never touched the money in the lockbox and that I had tried to explain that fact on the night he chose to believe Olivia instead of me. When I finished writing the message, I read it twice to make sure every sentence said exactly what I intended. Then I pressed the print button and watched as the pages slowly slid out of the printer beside the desk. The room felt very still as I folded the letter, placed it inside an envelope, and wrote my father's address across the front in careful block letters, almost identical to the handwriting I had seen on the envelope he sent to me. The moment I sealed the envelope, I knew something important had shifted. For 12 years the truth had lived quietly inside my memory, but now it was finally on its way back to the man who should have listened the first time. I dropped the envelope into the blue mailbox on the corner the next morning on my way to work, and for the rest of the day I tried not to think about it. The letter was out of my hands now, traveling across several states back toward the small town in Ohio that I had not seen in more than a decade. Part of me expected that once I mailed it, I would feel some kind of relief, like closing a door that had been left open for too long. Instead, what I felt was something quieter and more uncertain, like a chapter of my life that had been sealed away was slowly beginning to reopen. The next few days passed normally on the surface. I went to work, attended meetings, and reviewed financial reports the same way I always did. My coworkers talked about weekend plans and upcoming holidays while I nodded and participated in the conversations, but in the back of my mind I kept imagining a different scene unfolding nearly 1,000 miles away. I pictured my father walking out to his mailbox at the end of his driveway the same way he used to do every afternoon after work. I imagined him sorting through bills and advertisements before noticing an envelope with my handwriting across the front. The image was so clear in my mind that it almost felt like I was standing there watching it happen. I imagined him carrying the envelope inside and setting it down on the same kitchen table where the metal lockbox had once sat 12 years earlier. Maybe he would hesitate before opening it. Maybe he would recognize my handwriting immediately and realize that the truth he had ignored for so many years was finally sitting in front of him again. I wondered what his face would look like as he unfolded the paper and began reading the words I had written. I wondered if he would remember the night he told me to leave, the birthday cake still on the counter, the porch light buzzing above the door as it closed behind me. Most of all, I wondered if he would finally see the situation the way it had actually happened. Several days later, on a quiet Sunday morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee in my kitchen. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code was the same one from my hometown in Ohio. For a moment I simply stared at the phone while it vibrated softly on the counter. My heart was beating faster than it had in years. When I answered, the voice on the other end sounded older than I remembered, slower and unsteady in a way that made the years of distance suddenly feel very real. It was my father. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. I could hear him breathing through the phone as if he was struggling to find the right words. Finally he said my name quietly, the way he used to when I was a child sitting at the kitchen table doing homework. Then his voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. He told me that he had read my letter 3 times that morning. He said that with every sentence he realized more clearly how wrong he had been all those years ago. The truth, he said, had been sitting right in front of him the entire time, but he had chosen the easier story instead of the right one. I stood there in my kitchen holding the phone while the morning sunlight filled the room, listening as the man who had once closed the door on my life struggled to speak through the weight of his own regret. And in that moment I understood something that 12 years of silence had never fully revealed before. The letter I sent him had not just delivered the truth. It had finally forced him to face it. For several seconds after my father finished speaking, neither of us said anything. I stood in my kitchen with the phone against my ear, looking out the window at the quiet Denver street below while his words settled slowly in my mind. The man on the other end of the line sounded different from the father I remembered. His voice carried a weight that had not been there 12 years earlier, like the years had quietly reshaped him in ways that only regret can do. He told me that when he finished reading my letter that morning he had sat at the kitchen table for a long time staring at the same wall where our old family photos used to hang. He said he remembered my 18th birthday, the cake on the counter, the empty lockbox, and the moment he chose to believe Olivia without even asking another question. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how quickly he had turned a single accusation into a permanent decision. He admitted that over the years he had occasionally wondered if something about that night had never fully made sense, but every time the thought appeared he pushed it away because it was easier to believe the story he had already accepted. Now, after Olivia disappeared and the truth of her actions became clear, those old memories came back with a different meaning. He said my letter forced him to finally look at the past without excuses. When he finished speaking there was a long pause again, and then he asked a question that felt both simple and impossibly complicated at the same time. He asked if I would be willing to meet him. Not immediately, not even soon, but someday when I felt ready. I did not answer right away. Instead, I walked slowly across the room and sat down at the kitchen table, the same place where I had read his first letter only days earlier. Through the window I could see people walking along the sidewalk carrying groceries and talking with friends, completely unaware that a conversation nearly 1,000 miles long was quietly changing something inside my life. I thought about the 18-year-old girl who had stood on a porch with a suitcase and no idea where she was going. I thought about the years that followed, the late shifts at the diner, the small apartments, the long nights studying while building a future that no one else helped create. All of those years had shaped the person I had become, and none of them could be undone. Finally I spoke and told him the truth as clearly as I could. I said that the past could not be erased, and that the life I built since leaving home was something I was proud of. I told him that forgiveness is not a moment but a process that takes time and honesty from both sides. Then I said that maybe one day we could sit at the same table again and talk about everything that had happened, but that day would have to come slowly and carefully. On the other end of the line he exhaled quietly, as if the possibility of even a small future was more than he expected to receive. When the call ended I remained sitting at the table for a long moment, listening to the quiet apartment around me. The past had finally spoken, the truth had finally been heard, and for the first time in 12 years the story between my father and me was no longer frozen in the moment when a door closed. Instead it was something uncertain but open, like a road that had disappeared long ago and was only now beginning to appear again.